to Nole Edge, the official podcast of the College of Arts and Sciences at Florida State University. I'm your host, Amy Walden, the Assistant Director for Visual and Social Media with the College of Arts and Sciences, and today we welcome Paul Renfro, an Associate Professor with the Department of History here at FSU. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Paul studies the political and cultural history of the United States since 1945, with thematic interests in gender and sexuality, the carceral state, and childhood and the family. Paul earned his PhD in history from the University of Iowa, where he was a Lewis Pelzer Dissertation Fellow. He served as a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, before joining the Florida State University faculty in 2018. So today we're talking about the cultural phenomenon we've come to know as stranger danger, which was one of the main focuses of a book you published in 2020. So can you tell us a little bit about your book titled Stranger Danger, Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State, and also what the concept of stranger danger is?
Right. So I grew up with this concept. I think a lot of people grow up with this concept concerning strangers, people you don't know, as being potentially dangerous, and folks of whom you should be wary and suspicious. And so, I was particularly interested in this subject concerning stranger kidnapping because there seemed to be such an outsized sort of or exaggerated response to it culturally and politically. And so I wanted to kind of excavate the roots of that. So that brought me to this book topic, right? So I wanted to learn why this became such a hot topic in this moment, specifically in the 1980s. And so I traced it all back, even though this phenomenon has deeper roots in Indian captivity narratives and ransom kidnappings. This sort of contemporary phenomenon of stranger danger and this contemporary fear over stranger kidnapping specifically really dates back to 1979 or so. And I think that can tell us a great deal about politics in that moment, about anxiety kind of broadly in that moment on a society-wide basis. And it can kind of, I think, shine a light on childhood in that moment and the family, what sorts of concerns people had, how that reflected the moment.
Yeah. How did you first become interested in this topic to begin with?
So when I was doing my PhD at the University of Iowa, I learned about these paperboy kidnappings that took place in 1982 and 1984. And I was really interested in the sort of rhetoric that people were using surrounding those incidents. And they very much kind of situated it within this sense of kind of Midwestern nice and Midwestern stability, right? And so there was this sense that in the 80s, things were starting to unravel. And the farm crisis is going on in Iowa at the time. There's this broader concern about just the way of life that Iowans and Midwesterners in general had been enjoying, at least as they imagined it, right? And so these paperboy kidnappings, which remain unsolved, very much sort of represented that or symbolized these deeper concerns that people had. So I got to thinking about those cases, and then I wanted to situate those cases within this broader discourse, this national discourse about stranger danger, about crime, about the threats that supposedly kind of faced this idealized vision of the American family. So that was kind of the genesis.
It's fascinating research, I will say.
Thank you.
And in the book, you talk about the Aton Pates case, a child who disappeared in Manhattan in 1979, and how that seemed to be a catalyst in the stranger danger panic that gripped the country beginning in the late 1970s. But obviously, this wasn't the first child to ever go missing. So what was it about this case specifically that started to shift the national landscape?
Yeah, so the context is really important. So this happens in Manhattan, in Soho specifically. And so this is the financial capital of the United States. This is in many ways the kind of cultural capital of the United States. And New York is in crisis in the 1970s. It is on the verge of bankruptcy. It has a crime problem. It is seeming to come apart at the seams, right? Or it appears to be coming apart at the seams, or at least that's the kind of narrative that's attached to it. And so when Eitan Pates goes missing, in this really sort of poignant way, walking to school for the first time ever on the way to the school bus, and it's, a block and a half or 2 blocks away from his home in Soho, and he just vanishes, and there really is no sense of what happened to him for a long time, and there remain questions about exactly what happened. But this, is fodder for the news media, and it has a sort of resonance because of the pictures that exist of Eitan, because his father was a professional photographer, and so he has captured these beautiful photos of his son, and these are ready for prime time in essence. So the newspapers print his photo, TV stations also publicize his photo, and it becomes so kind of symbolic or emblematic of what a lot of people believe to be a larger concern, right? And so this discourse about missing children, that's the term that people use again and again, and it kind of connotes this broader problem, even though this is a very kind of exaggerated problem in that stranger abductions are extremely rare in the United States, extremely rare. So estimates vary, but some people say 100 or so cases in the U.S. annually. Some people say a little higher. Some people say a little lower than 100. But there is this sense that it's actually an epidemic, this particular problem, not parental kidnappings, not runaways. And so Eitan and Adam Walsh, John Walsh's son, these paperboy kidnappings, right, they all sort of speak to this broader problem, even though they're not representative of any real kind of epidemic, as tragic as they are, and not to diminish the severity of the offense, right, or the severity of the tragedy. But this becomes kind of politically useful for a lot of entities, a lot of agents or kind of actors, and also parents kind of use this as evidence of this crisis facing the family and their children, and so they take action, right? They respond to these particular cases.
Another theme you discuss in the book is the role that both race and sexuality played in the national subconscious. What recurring themes did we see in the national conversations about stranger danger in regard to these topics? Yeah,
so these really important cases that I mentioned that really kind of capture the nation's attention all involve young, white, and kind of photogenic children, people like Eitan Pates, right? And so that kind of spoke to concerns that purportedly faced the white kind of idealized family. And this has these really deep roots in American history. There's this notion specifically in the New Deal era that, the white family is sort of sacrosanct and needs to be preserved. And this becomes sort of the basis for a lot of New Deal policymaking, racially discriminatory housing policies and things of that nature, all kind of supported by this vision of the kind of white heteronormative 2-parent family. And a lot of these anxieties are kind of revived in this period in the wake of various liberation movements. So the women's liberation movement, gay liberation, the African American freedom struggle. And this kind of comes to a head in the 70s and the 80s, right? It seems like everyone is talking about the family at this moment. And Reagan is very much interested in that sort of politics. So this problem or this larger sort of panic that's generated through these cases, it makes sense that it happened in this moment, right? So Eitan, Adam Walsh, the Iowa paperboy kidnappings with Johnny Gosch and Eugene Wade Martin, and some other cases, these really kind of drive the movement, and I think convince a lot of people that these sorts of children are particularly susceptible. When, as we've established, this is actually a very rare sort of thing, right? This sort of stranger abduction of young children, and when children go missing, it tends to be older people, older teenagers, and they tend to be either runaways or parental abductees. So this sort of power of these sorts of images and these sorts of stories completely distort the picture, right? And serve this sort of larger political purpose and kind of lead to this cultural narrative coalescing.
Yeah, and that brings us perfectly to the next question. You discuss in your book how the stranger danger panic influenced a wave of federal laws and initiatives, which you collectively describe in the book as the child safety regime. Can you talk about some of these types of measures and why they were often met with little opposition?
Yeah, because this is a really sensitive subject, and no one wants to be perceived as antagonistic to the family or antagonistic to children. And so this has bipartisan support, right? And so, this entire kind of child safety regime that I talk about was constructed by Republicans and Democrats, and they often kind of collaborated on this and were oftentimes kind of competing to see who would be the most vocal champion of kind of child safety laws, of family protection, measures.
Very interesting. And you mentioned in your book that the perceived stranger danger threat really became sort of a way of life that never truly ended. And I grew up in the 90s. I can definitely attest to this. I remember in elementary school being told what to do if you are being lured to a car, for candy or, oh, here's my puppy, things like that. That is just a normal way of life now. So what do you think are some of the reasons for this staying power of stranger danger in our culture?
Yeah, I think those sorts of narratives, and this maybe speaks to this larger sort of fascination with true crime that we're enduring, right? I think these sorts of narratives have a kind of appeal because it's such an unspeakable sort of idea, the notion that someone would lure a child to a van and then, harm that child. There's this kind of cultural fixation on that and on murder and on, these really unspeakable acts. So I think that even though maybe some people acknowledge or many people acknowledge that this is not the epidemic that they believe it to be, there is this sort of allure to this kind of sick sort of fixation on this sort of crime or this sort of problem. Again, I think the politics of childhood and the family just pop up again and again. Even when it's kind of invisible or submerged, oftentimes we're talking about issues that directly relate to this idealized vision, romanticized vision of the family. So this issue is kind of, it speaks to that. It's at the core of that, right? What could be more fundamentally political than the child or, the safety of the child. And again, the kind of the narratives are all around us in these true crime texts that are so incredibly popular.
Yeah, that actually makes so much sense. If people are interested in learning more about your work on the stranger danger topic or other areas of research, where can they find more information?
Well, they can look at my FSU faculty page, and there's some information there about a new book project I'm working on concerning Ryan White, the teenager with hemophilia who contracted HIV and later died of AIDS-related causes, and whose name is imprinted on the Ryan White Care Act and HIV/AIDS program, which is still this really important federal program or set of programs designed to alleviate the HIV/AIDS crisis, but which presents similar issues concerning, the politics of innocence and childhood in the family. So there's some information about that. And some of my public writing also is linked.
Wonderful. Looking forward to reading more about it. So we end every podcast with our bowl of mystery questions. So Paul, go ahead and draw a question and answer.
All right. What's my favorite food? Chips and salsa.
Oh, good choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't go wrong with some chips and salsa. Spicy or no?
Oh, spicy.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a Texan, so.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So, Paul, thank you so much for joining us on Nole Edge today. And if you'd like to learn more about Paul Renfro and his research, you can read more by visiting history.fsu.edu and clicking on the faculty page. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.